What's going on, everybody? Mustang Kyle here. It's been quite a while since I made one of these videos. I posted about 4 years ago the introduction to my Beetle build, and between working full-time hours and just working on the car after work, trying to film and edit stuff, it's just way too much. So I apologize to those who were excited for the build series. I would have loved to do it, honestly, and I did a lot of filming for it. I just couldn't get around to editing it, and then eventually I was so far into the build that I kind of just gave up on the whole thing. So once again, I apologize for not following through with that, but here I am now. I'm gonna make a update video. The car is currently broken, but I did complete it. And then I drove it twice before I broke it. Well, I drove it once before I broke it. I broke it on the second drive. So I have a bunch of footage and a bunch of pictures of the build, and I'm going to show you guys all that and do some voiceover to let you know what's going on and explain things a little bit better. And then you'll see how I broke it. And then I'll go through what I'm going to do to fix it and improve it so I don't have that issue again. So if you've been waiting for this video for the last 4 years, then thanks a lot for waiting. I really appreciate it. If this is the first video of mine that you've seen, welcome to my channel. Please check out my other videos, give them a like, comment on them, let me know what you think, and subscribe to my channel. Enjoy the rest of the video. If you're interested in purchasing a t-shirt or a hoodie and supporting me in the builds, I'll post a link for those in the description. So the first thing that I did with the car is I marked out where I want to put a hole in the roof. The reason I was doing this is because I was going to make the car so low that I basically wouldn't be able to use the doors anymore. And it also helped with chopping the top because I didn't have to do as much welding on the roof. So next I tried to figure out what radius I wanted in the corners, and then I made a template. And then from there, I took a grinder and put a little hole in the roof that I could fit my electric hand shears through. So I took a rough cut with the electric hand shear and then did a final mark about 1/2 inch away from my original mark, and then took one final cut with the hand shears and finished it off. So I got this nice clean look, and then later on I could fold that 1/2 inch under and make a nice edge. Unfortunately, I don't have any footage of chopping the A and the B pillar of the car, but you can see that I did that. And now you can see that I'm trying to figure out where the best place is to cut the body, to cut the window down, and basically figure out how much I want to cut the window down as well. Once I figured out how short I wanted to cut it and I marked it out, I took it outside and chopped it down. And then so here you can see, brought it back in and just lined up the B pillars and fitting the rear section there to get welded back together. And then here you can see we're just tacking it together. I'm holding it nice and level, nice and flat, and then my father is just tacking it together. Once that's done, then we're ready to attach the rear section again. So we needed to fool around with it a little bit to get the flanges that hold the rear window to line up with each other. But once we did that, then you can see here I'm holding it and getting it tacked on as well. Also, you can see that we had to cut it in half and add a little strip in the middle just to widen it out to get the rear window to line up with each other as well, because of the taper of the window. So it basically went from looking like a pile of scrap metal to this here with the chop top 4 inches and the body section 6.5. So these next two pictures are basically us planning out the chassis itself. So we got some wheels sitting at the right distance apart for width and the wheelbase is correct. And then we sat the Hayabusa engine in place there, as well as this little mock-up seat and Willwood pedal cluster that I got. Once we figured out a bunch of measurements, we started building the chassis. So we started with the bottom, and then here is a roll hoop that I'm notching for the bottom frame rails. And then we bent up the upper frame rails. And then here's a picture of my father. We're just basically planning the whole thing out. And then here is it coming together with some vertical supports in it. And I think the next picture here, we're mounting the engine in it. And here's a few pictures of the body sitting over the chassis. And as you can see, it is a single seater. So we finished off the back of the chassis and mounted the engine, and then started working on the front control arms. Here's all the pieces cut for it, and then you can see I made up a jig to weld them all together so they're all the same. And then once that was done, mounted them to the chassis. And then I got my steering rack mounted as well. And then I built a sliding assembly for my pedals, since my seat is fixed, but I wanted some adjustability for legroom. And then you can see in this picture here, I added some tie rods so I can steer. Then I built a mount for the Gen 1 Hayabusa cluster, as well as the steering column. I also mounted the Hayabusa's hand controls for the lights and the kill switch and the start switch on there as well. These here are some parts that I had machined, and they are all for my straight axle assembly. So these are bearing carriers here, and then you can see here, basically that is a hub on the end of it, and there was a straight solid axle. You can see it mounted in place here. I was lucky enough to have Willwood come on board, and they hooked me up with a bunch of parts. I got a rear brake setup for a midget race car. I had a 6-piston brake setup for a Miata for the front, and then they also sent me a pedal set as well. And here is the brake setup for the front, all attached to the knuckle. Next, I started to try to figure out where I wanted to put the coilovers. I knew I wanted to do a cantilever setup, so I was just trying to figure out what made the most sense. And I also started to complete the radius rods that go to my rear end, as well as the panhard bar, which you can see in this photo. I added some more tubes to the chassis to strengthen it up. And I built a linkage system here so you can shift the transmission from the bike. And the cool thing about using the bike transmission is that you have a sequential gearbox. So what you're looking at here is a jackshaft assembly. And the reason I did this is because I wanted to reduce the gearing from the motorcycle's gearing, so I needed a bigger sprocket, but my axle was actually too close to the engine. So what I did was I run a chain from the engine to the jackshaft, and then from the jackshaft to the axle forward. And then I put the whole assembly on these turnbuckles here so I could adjust it front to back. And I also added a rear brake on there as well. So I was working on the rear suspension again, as well as the front, and you can see that I used these bell cranks with a slot in them. And what that did was it allowed me to change the distance from the pivot to the push rod mount, and that changes the leverage that the shock has on it, as well as the distance that the wheel will travel up and down in relation to how much the coilover compresses. So I had a ton of adjustability there, and then once I figured that out, figured out where I liked the push rod mounting, then I made up some proper ones that didn't have a slot in it. Here's another clip of my pedal assembly. You can see there's a push-pull cable on the throttle pedal, and then there's a threaded bung that's welded onto the aluminum plate, and then a spring-loaded plunger threads in there, and then the pin goes in all these holes on that plate that's welded beside the slider, and that's what keeps it from moving front to back when I don't want it to. And here's the other end of the push-pull cable attached to the original throttle cable off of the bike that goes to the throttle body. So at this point I had pretty much all the fabrication done, so I stripped the chassis, I weighed it, it weighs 121.6 pounds, and then I brought it to our other shop and started welding it. Once I got the whole thing welded, it took me quite a lot of hours. Then I threw all the parts in my father's truck, brought them over to our other shop, and then our co-op kid at the time, Jake, he wanted to work on it, so I let him start assembling it. Here's a few pictures of it back together again, as well as 2 videos displaying how the suspension works. I was lucky enough to have Dime PSI sponsor the build, and they sent me a ton of AN fittings, AN lines. They sent me like 50 feet of dash 16 line for my rad hoses, and as well as some other small parts for my fuel system. I made up these nice mounts for my rad hoses and my clutch line that ran from basically the engine, which is pretty close to the back, up to the rad at the front, and to the pedal assembly for the clutch line. Once again, thank you so much, Dime PSI, for coming aboard and helping me out with all these parts. So up next here, you'll see I'm making a little cover, and basically it just covers up the wiring harness. We used the factory wiring harness, and a buddy of mine, Jason, helped me extend all the wires for the hand controls and the gauge cluster. At this point, the car weighed about 680 pounds as it was sitting, so I was actually able to just lift it up onto some jack stands. And the next clip is the first time that we had the car running. You can see that I'm making up a little firewall type thing, and what it does basically is it really just protects me from rocks and stuff coming off the front tires. I also used it to mount the body to the chassis, and here's some other mounts that I made up. These were basically so I had a structure underneath the door so I could use the edge of the door here to step on when I'm climbing over the roof and into the car. Obviously, it's hard to tell how much weight I'm putting on here, but it does support my body weight, absolutely no problem at all. And here I mounted my front headlights, which was a little bit challenging because they had to clear the hood when it lifted up. They also had to clear the wheels when I turned. Earl's Performance Plumbing sent me a bunch of brake lines, which was awesome. Thank you, Earl's. And after that, I sent the car out to get it painted. And here's a bunch of pictures of reassembly with everything painted except for the jackshaft assembly, because at that point I decided to add a reverse gear on there. And so I used a starter motor and I made up my own flex plate. I had it laser cut, and basically I would wire up the electric motor so when I hit a switch to hit reverse, it would run the jackshaft backwards, which would essentially spin the axle backwards. Here is a picture of my seat. It is made from a sheet of titanium, which TMS Titanium actually gave to me. Thank you guys for that. And it is water jet cut, and I did all the holes individually dimple dyed, and it is one of my favorite pieces on the car. So at this point, I'm basically scrambling to get the car done because in about a day or two, my wife and I are moving across the country to British Columbia. So it's all hands on deck. My father's helping me with the wiring. My wife's father is over helping with the wiring as well. And we're just trying to get the car done, trying to get all the little things buttoned up and get the brakes bled and the coolant bled and the clutch bled. And when we were bleeding the clutch, we ran into an issue. So the Gen 1 Hayabusa's slave cylinder mount is extremely thin cast aluminum, and if you put any pressure on it at all, it completely shatters. So we ran into that issue, and unfortunately I never got to drive the car before we left Ontario. So we got the car strapped down to the trailer. Obviously made sure we said that's not going anywhere, so it wasn't going to go anywhere. And then my wife and I set off for British Columbia. So here's a few pictures of the car on the trip. Here's the car on the trailer. We finally made it to our condo in British Columbia, and here's a video of my wife steering the car as I pushed it into the underground parking. You can see just how rusty the body got. We got a ton of rain while we were driving out there. And the car sat down here for about 5 or 6 months until I collected parts and was ready to work on it again. I needed to get some wiring done to get it running properly, as I didn't have a clutch switch. So I had Steve from Wireworks finish that off for me. Lucky enough to be able to work on the car at a shop called Motorsports, and that's where I finished it off. I got the billet slave cylinder mounted up, and I got the clutch bled and finished off bleeding the coolant as it had some air pockets in it, and then I took the car for its first drive. thanks to Dapper Lighting for sending me these headlights. They are black housed, they have a LED projector for the main light, and they have a switchback halo for my signals. So up next is the first time I drove the car, which was very exciting. You'll notice I was a little hesitant as soon as I turned onto the street since I heard a strange clunking noise. I'll let you guys enjoy this clip and listen for the sound yourself. I had a suspicion that under load the chain was skipping, so I had someone take a video of the rear end of the car, and that's when everything went wrong. So as you can see, the axle bent pretty badly right where the sprocket was welded on. In hindsight, I see that there was basically no front to back support for the center of the axle. At this point, I did a lot of questioning where to go from here. Do I make a much stronger axle? Do I attempt to brace the center of the axle? Or do I just change the direction that I was going completely and build an independent rear suspension setup with a chain-driven differential? Unfortunately, since the axle travels through the chain from the engine to the jackshaft, I couldn't make the diameter any larger, and if I can't make the diameter any larger, then I don't think that I could really make it any stronger than it already was. So maybe I could brace the axle. If I wanted to support the center of the axle, the brace would have to be able to follow the path of the axle when it's traveling through its suspension, which means that I would have to make an arm that mounts to a similar place as the 4-link arms do. However, the engine would be directly in the way of doing that, so that's not really an option either. So that leaves me with the third option. Redesign the entire rear end and build an independent rear suspension setup with a chain-driven diff. This is definitely the most work and will take the most amount of time and money to do. However, I think that I'm going to be really happy with the end result. Here's a bit of a preview of what I've been working on. In my next video, I'm going to go through it in depth and explain exactly what you're looking at here, and also go through what changes have to be made to the Beetle's chassis and what parts I'm going to need to make or purchase. So this has been a recap of the past 4 years of building the Beetle. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's been a long time coming and I'm pretty excited to finally get it out there. Once again, I apologize for not following through with the build series. I'm planning on posting a lot more videos in the near future, so please keep an eye out for them. And thank you so much for watching.